July 5, 1941. The valley of the Litsa River, 60 kilometers northwest of Murmansk, inside the Arctic Circle. The sun does not set here in high summer, and under its flat, unblinking light, German mountain troops of the Second and Third Gebirgsdivisionen scramble over broken granite towards a wooden bridge. Below them, the Litsa runs cold and fast between banks of bare rock and stunted scrub, the last trees having given up several kilometers to the south. There is no birdsong. There is barely any soil. The men carry rifles their fathers might have carried in the Alps, but nothing in their training has prepared them for a landscape with almost no cover, no roads, and no darkness to hide their advance. Ahead of them, dug into the rock itself, Soviet riflemen of the 14th Army wait behind stone parapets that took the place of trenches no shovel could cut into frozen ground. This is the opening clash of a battle that would grind on, largely unresolved, for 3 years. It would come to be known, bitterly, by the German soldiers who fought it as the Duchy of Litsa, a private, forgotten kingdom of rock and ice that swallowed men and equipment with almost nothing to show for it. Historians would later call this stretch of the Eastern Front the most static of the entire war, a front line that barely moved more than 15 miles in either direction between 1941 and 1944, even as armies further south tore across 1,000 kilometers of steppe. It has no famous name in the West, no film, no household date. But it decided whether one of the most important supply routes of the entire war would stay open, and it produced a form of combat unlike almost anywhere else on Earth. Warfare fought not in trenches, but on top of the ground, in stone forts built by hand on the tundra, under a sun and a darkness that each lasted for months at a time. The reason any of this happened at all was Murmansk. Unlike almost every other Soviet port, Murmansk does not freeze in winter because a branch of the Gulf Stream keeps its waters open even in the depths of the Arctic night. That single fact made it one of only a handful of gateways through which Britain and, later, the United States could funnel supplies to the Soviet war effort by sea. Convoys braved German aircraft and U-boats operating out of occupied Norway to bring tanks, aircraft, fuel, and ammunition into Murmansk's harbor, where a single rail line then carried them south towards the rest of the country. If Germany could seize that port, or simply sever the railway that fed from it, an entire artery of Allied support to the Soviet Union would close. Adolf Hitler handed the task to General Eduard Dietl, already celebrated in Germany as the hero of Narvik, for his defense of that Norwegian port a year earlier. Dietl's Mountain Corps Norway, built around troops trained for the high Alps, was given a mission that looked simple on a map. Advance perhaps 100 kilometers east from the Norwegian-Finnish border and take Murmansk before the onset of the Arctic winter closed the campaign down. The plan, part of the wider assault on the Soviet Union codenamed Operation Silberfuchs, or Silver Fox, assumed the same kind of rapid armored breakthroughs that were then shattering Soviet lines further south. What the planners had not reckoned with was the ground itself. This is a landscape of exposed granite, marsh, and permafrost, cut by countless small lakes and rivers with no metalled roads to speak of and barely any soil deep enough to bury a man, let alone dig a trench system. Column after column of German mountain infantry found themselves advancing at little more than a kilometer an hour, over terrain more suited to a lunar expedition than a summer offensive. There were no maps worth the name. The region had barely been surveyed before the war, and waiting for them, dug in along the Litsa, sat 2 Soviet rifle divisions, the 14th and the 52nd, whose soldiers proved far tougher than German intelligence had predicted. Motivated, disciplined, and fighting on ground they knew intimately, they held the river line through July and August 1941, even as Dietl brought up reinforcements and mounted repeated attempts to force a crossing. German forces did manage in places to force small footholds on the far bank of the Litsa, only to see Soviet counterattacks close each one down within days. By July 18th, Dietl's corps was already stretched across a front of some 36 miles with barely enough men to hold it, and he warned his superiors bluntly that without further reinforcement the entire Murmansk operation was finished. 4 fresh battalions arrived from Norway at the end of that month, scraped together despite Hitler's insistence that Norway itself remain heavily garrisoned against a feared Allied invasion, and on August 2nd, Dietl launched a renewed attempt to clear the Litsa Bay area. It took his men a further day simply to march the last stretch to the river, over ground so broken that some units covered barely a kilometer an hour, only to discover on arrival that 2 full Soviet rifle divisions were already dug in ahead of them, the position having been reinforced weeks earlier by the local Soviet commander, General Valerian Frolov, in anticipation of exactly this kind of renewed assault. By September, after 3 failed efforts to break through and losses running into the thousands, Dietl was forced to withdraw his men onto a defensive line along the Litsa itself. The drive on Murmansk, meant to be settled in weeks, had stalled for good. A parallel German thrust further south, Operation Arctic Fox, aimed at severing the Murmansk railway rather than the port, came close to success in November before Finnish support for the operation cooled, again under the weight of Allied diplomatic pressure on Helsinki. What followed on the Litsa itself was not a retreat, and it was not a Soviet counteroffensive either. It was something rarer in this war, a genuine stalemate, one that would hold for 3 long years while the rest of the Eastern Front convulsed through some of the largest battles in human history. Positional warfare on the Litsa front looked almost nothing like it did anywhere else. Because the permafrost made conventional trenches impossible to dig with hand tools, both sides built their defenses upward instead of downward, stacking loose granite into stone sangars and bunkers reinforced with what timber could be dragged up from the tree line, far to the south. German troops came to call the endless labor of hauling rock and building these positions the real war, more exhausting in its way than the fighting itself. Soldiers on both sides existed inside what amounted to small fortified villages of stone, connected by paths picked between boulders, with observation posts perched on the highest outcrops to watch for the other side's patrols. Supply was its own battle. With almost no roads, the German Mountain Corps built narrow-gauge cable car systems, sometimes called devil's ladders, by the men who had to load and unload them, to haul ammunition, food, and fuel up over ridgelines that no lorry could climb. Where they could, engineers cut rough tracks through the rock, giving them names that stuck for the rest of the campaign. The Landweg, running up towards the central sector, and further east the roads the men themselves nicknamed after Titovka and the Litsa. Reindeer and pack mules, requisitioned in Norway and Finland, hauled loads where even the cable cars could not reach. The scale of the effort involved in simply feeding and arming a few tens of thousands of men in this terrain rivaled in relative terms campaigns fought with far larger forces elsewhere. On the Soviet side, the Northern Fleet under Admiral Arseny Golovko played an unusual role for a naval command, ferrying troops and supplies along the coast and mounting amphibious landings behind German lines in Litsa Bay. On one occasion putting some 6,000 men of the 12th Marine Brigade ashore in a single operation, using the sea as the road that the land itself could not provide. The climate imposed its own casualties, entirely separate from combat. Summers here bring the midnight sun, with daylight lasting around the clock for roughly 2 months, followed by a polar night in winter during which the sun barely clears the horizon at all. Temperatures could fall to minus 30 degrees Celsius or lower, turning frostbite and exposure into as serious a threat as enemy fire, particularly for German troops whose cold-weather equipment, adequate for the Alps, proved insufficient for an Arctic winter. Soviet units, better acclimatized and better supplied for the conditions, suffered too, but generally coped more effectively with a climate that punished any lapse in preparation. What emerged from this was neither a true siege nor a conventional front line, but something closer to a fortified standoff. 2 armies dug into rock outcrops a few hundred meters apart in places, exchanging patrols, sniper fire and artillery duels across a landscape so barren that a single fallen soldier might lie undiscovered among the boulders for decades. Morale among the German mountain troops, according to accounts from the period, sank badly as the campaign dragged into its second and third years with no prospect of the promised victory at Murmansk. Rumors circulated, not entirely without foundation, that the mountain divisions had effectively been abandoned in this remote theater while the war's decisive battles were fought elsewhere. Reinforcements arrived all the same. Hitler sent the 6th Mountain Division and additional SS units to bolster Dietl's corps, though even getting them there proved hazardous. A German transport convoy carrying troops was nearly destroyed at sea by British cruisers, saved only when the German escort vessel Bremse rammed one of the attacking ships and was cut in two in the process. Soviet submarines and Royal Air Force Hurricane squadrons, flying from Murmansk itself in support of the Soviet Northern Fleet, made German naval resupply along this stretch of coast increasingly costly, until German Naval Command judged further attempts too dangerous to continue. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know, and it costs nothing. The Litsa front, precisely because it settled into stalemate so early, offers an unusually direct comparison between the two mountain warfare doctrines that produced it. German Gebirgsjäger doctrine, refined in the Alps and the Balkans, assumed maneuver would eventually be possible if enough men, mules, and cable car capacity were brought to bear. It was built around the idea that any terrain could eventually be crossed. Soviet doctrine on this front leaned instead on static defense in depth, using the very ground that frustrated German plans to its own advantage, layering successive defensive belts of stone strongpoints, minefields, and artillery positions that German mountain troops never fully cracked in 3 attempts. Where German planners had expected a campaign measured in weeks, the tally by autumn 1941 ran to well over 10,000 German and Finnish casualties for barely 25 kilometers of ground gained, a ratio of loss to territory that had no real equivalent on the more mobile stretches of the Eastern Front that same year. Finland's role in the campaign, meanwhile, remained deliberately limited and diplomatically fraught. Finnish forces supported the parallel drive further south, aimed at cutting the Murmansk railway rather than the port itself, but reduced their commitment as the year wore on, partly under pressure from Allied diplomatic channels anxious to keep Finland's participation in the war against the Soviet Union from expanding further. It is a reminder that even within this single theater, the coalition fighting the Soviet Union was not uniformly committed to every objective Berlin set for it. Set against the Western Allied experience of Arctic warfare at Narvik in 1940 or in the brief, miserable Aleutian campaign in the Pacific, the Litsa front stands out for its sheer duration. Most Arctic combat elsewhere in the war was measured in weeks or months, decided by a single landing or a short, sharp battle for a port. This one lasted, essentially unchanged in its broad contours, from July 1941 until October 1944, making it very likely the longest continuous positional stalemate fought anywhere in the Second World War, and by most accounts the largest body of fighting ever conducted north of the Arctic Circle. Even the more celebrated static fronts of the war, at places like Monte Cassino, were resolved in months rather than years. The Litsa line simply outlasted almost every comparison that might be drawn against it in any theater. That stalemate finally broke in October 1944, and when it did, it broke fast. With Finland's exit from the war that September removing any diplomatic constraint on Soviet operations in the region, the Karelian Front under General Kirill Meretskov launched the Petsamo-Kirkenes offensive on October 7, 1944, throwing something in the order of 100,000 Soviet troops, backed by tanks, artillery, and the Northern Fleet, against a German 19th Mountain Corps, numbering somewhere in the region of 50 to 60,000 men, dug in behind 3 successive defensive lines that German engineers had spent 3 years perfecting. What 3 years of static warfare had failed to resolve took roughly 3 weeks to settle. Soviet forces broke through the Litsa and Titovka positions within the first 2 days, took the port of Petsamo on October 15th, crossed into Norwegian territory before the month was out, and liberated the Norwegian town of Kirkenes on October 25th, the first Norwegian town to be freed from German occupation. The offensive formally concluded on October 29, 1944, with Soviet casualties recorded at around 21,000 killed, wounded, and missing, and German losses for the month as a whole running to roughly 8,000. The material impact of the entire Litsa campaign is, in truth, easier to state than its human cost, much of which remains only partially documented even today. What is not in dispute is that Murmansk never fell, and the railway line behind it never closed for good, meaning that one of the Soviet Union's principal lifelines to its Western allies remained open throughout the war, even as convoys bound for the port paid a heavy price of their own on the Arctic seas. Over the full course of the war, the Allies would deliver more than 5,000 tanks, some 7,400 aircraft, and close to 5,000 anti-tank guns to the Soviet Union along this route, a flow of material that a successful German capture of Murmansk in 1941 might well have strangled its source. The psychological toll on the German mountain divisions, tied down for 3 years in a theater that never delivered the victory Berlin had promised them, is harder to measure, but is attested to repeatedly in the accounts of those who served there, several of whom described a growing sense that they had been quietly forgotten by the war's wider narrative, even as they fought and died for it. Precise casualty figures for the full 3 years of positional fighting on the Litsa are not easy to reconstruct with confidence, scattered as they are across German, Soviet, and Finnish records of very different quality, and any single total offered for the whole campaign should be treated as an estimate rather than a settled figure. That sense of being forgotten has, in a literal way, outlasted the war itself. In the decades since, volunteers around the town of Nikel, close to the old front line, have continued to search the tundra for the remains of soldiers who fell there and were never recovered, work that by some accounts has returned dozens of men to a proper burial only in recent years, work that in places continues to this day. A memorial complex, the Valley of Glory, now stands on the banks of the river where the fighting was heaviest, honoring the defenders of the Soviet Arctic. The stone sangars the two armies built by hand, in ground too frozen to dig, still mark hillsides across the old front, quietly outlasting the men who piled them there. Return, for a moment, to that bridge over the Litsa on July 5, 1941. The mountain troops who reached it that day, trained for the Alps and ordered to take a port 100 kilometers to their east, could not have known they were about to begin the longest stalemate of the entire war, in a theater so remote that most histories of the conflict barely mention it at all. They would spend 3 years there, building forts out of stone because the ground refused them anything softer, hauling their supplies up cable cars because no lorry could follow them, watching the sun circle the sky without setting and then vanish for months at a time, fighting an enemy who proved far more capable than they had been told to expect. 3 summers came and went over that valley, each one as bright and endless as the last, and 3 winters closed in after them, each one as dark. Nothing about the ground changed in all that time. Nothing about the two armies facing each other across it changed very much either, until, in the space of 3 weeks in October 1944, everything did. Murmansk stood, the railway ran, the tanks and the aircraft kept moving south along it in the numbers the Soviet war effort needed them to move. And the war, in the end, moved on without the men who had fought for 3 years to decide that single question, settled elsewhere, by other battles, in other places whose names are far better remembered than the Litsas, while the Duchy of Litsa held its ground in the one corner of the war that time and memory both seemed content to leave behind. It was not a small battle. It was not a short one either, longer, in fact, than almost any other stretch of continuous close combat the Second World War produced. It was simply a forgotten one. And for 3 years, inside the Arctic Circle, on ground where nothing could be buried and nothing, it seems, could be forgotten quite fast enough, it was the only battle that mattered to the men fighting it, stone by stone, ridge by ridge, in a war that the rest of the world has spent 80 years failing to remember,